This is Cade, and I'm here to do my little podcast, so I'm going to go ahead and get right into it. So the question that I chose was to connect something from this unit to my major and explain its importance. And I chose to connect a lot of things, civilizations actually, to our culture. There's a couple questions that I want to answer. What traits of an empire are conducive to longevity? What style of governance works? And then what part of any does development of thought play? As I kind of think through those questions, I then want to answer how can we use those answers to help us maybe understand or interact with the current foreign and maybe even domestic policy in America today. And I'm going to jump all the way back to Assyria to start. Assyria is going to be the first country that I talk about. So Assyria was characterized by 6 different cycles of expansion and then collapse, and they became the first great world power under Sennacherib, I believe. And he's the one who consolidated and held the territory, the most territory that is, but not for a terribly long time. We get the Lachish reliefs under him. Hopefully I'm pronouncing that right, but I doubt it, which details Sennacherib's military prowess and his eventual total conquest. And so we can kind of see this might that Assyria has. They're an extremely brutal people group. When they conquer Egypt and parts of Greece, they're not really giving mercy. They're slaughtering entire cities. And the king has absolute power, and he's obviously a tyrant. And they collapsed due to the Persians and Medes because they were a little bit too warlike. Again, they lasted for almost 2,000 years, but they were only a major world power for a few hundred. So from Assyria, we learned that military power does help build empires. We'll come back to that later. Moving straight into Persia. Persia's different. Persia wants to give their citizens rights. As we look at Cyrus the Great, he has extreme military skill. He can wipe out a city, but he's more likely to convince a city to throw their leaders out and open their gates. He uses diplomacy and conquers through propaganda, which I found to be absolutely wild. Within 30 years, he's conquered just absolutely huge swaths of the known world, and he starts to put all sorts of systems in place that allow his empire to be ruled better. And Darius I continues that. He puts roads into place. We have different systems of political governance, but I'm going to talk about that a little bit later. And we also get the Oxus chariot model from our book of the 100 Objects, and that kind of depicts how rebellions can be squashed, right? You can get all of these troops moving down roads very quickly. It's a very ordered society, but it's full of diplomacy, and it is full of class mobility because anybody can buy into this idea of being Persian, even slaves and conquered peoples, which is part of what makes it such a great nation. So the main takeaway that I take from Persia is diplomacy, because they did eventually fall, but they fell kind of due to outside circumstances. It wasn't all their fault. There's a little bit of ambition by some of the Persian leaders, but again, it's good to remember that we need to keep our people happy and practice diplomacy. That seems to do well for empires. On to Greece now. We're just going to jump straight down to Alexander the Great. He's the empire we want to focus on. He makes his army larger than even his father's huge army. I believe his father was Philip II of Macedon. And he tends to follow the Persian model by convincing people rather than strictly conquering them, but he does conquer very hard. An example is when he massacred Tyre, obviously, and none of the other cities in the region decided to fight him after that. And the interesting thing about Alexander the Great is that he was taught by Aristotle, as the one primary source that we read tells a little bit. But he dies and he says, "Give my empire to the strongest," and it fractures his empire. But what's really interesting is that the political thought of Greece didn't fracture. Rome, who eventually conquered them, and even America today, took those political ideas and institutions that were instituted really in Athens mostly and built their civilizations around those Greek ideals. And we see this through the coin with the head of Alexander that we read about in our 100 Objects book. The influence of Greece ultimately, I don't think, was military power, but rather political power and ideas. So we learn that political systems are important and ideas are very important from Greece. So to recap, from Assyria, and this is obviously simplifying a little bit for time's sake, but Assyria shows us that power is useful. Persia shows us diplomacy is useful, and Greece gives us political systems and far-reaching ideas. Now, I'm a political science major, so I'm going to try to connect this to my major, obviously. So my main question after going through that is, how can these three things we've learned help us deal with international and domestic relations? And why won't one type of power work by itself? So we're going to get straight into that question. And the reason that power doesn't work only by itself, a good example of this is MAD, which is mutually assured destruction. And MAD is really just the principle that two nuclear powers can't go to war with each other, because if they do, then they will both destroy each other. So clearly you can't only use power, but you also can't just use diplomacy. And a good example of this is Hitler's rise in the aftermath of World War I, in which the UK and France both left him alone to his own devices because they were a little too diplomatic and weren't willing to use force. So there must be some sort of blend of the two of them then. And we can see this in our foreign policy today. So first, let's take a look at the way that we interact with Ukraine in foreign policy. So first off, we supply them with weapons to help fight Russia. But on the other hand, we're trying to find an off-ramp with Russia. And you see the difference there between the Persia and the Assyrian different ideas, power and diplomacy. We do the same thing with Israel, supplying them with weapons in their fight against Hamas and allying ourselves with them while also encouraging them to temper what they're doing, and we slow down how quickly we're giving them resources, and that's kind of showing diplomacy in a certain sense. So now let's switch and start talking about domestic policy a little bit. If we look at Donald Trump, he wants to keep people happy with his economic policies and promises to secure our borders. Whereas Kamala Harris relies on her popular abortion positions and wanting to bring back Roe versus Wade and enshrine that in law. And so both political candidates want to make the other one seem to be a tyrant and make themselves appear more friendly to the American people, which I think is kind of reminiscent of those ancient Greek ideas. So now it's time to answer the big questions. First, what traits of an empire are conducive to longevity? And my answer is a mix of power and diplomacy underneath a political system that works well. And my next question, what style of governance works? Anything that is not tyrannical, so maybe a democracy or a good king that keeps his people happy. And those two questions go together quite nicely. My last one, what part, if any, does development of thought play? And I say a crucial role. You see Greek thought still around today, and continuing to think and improve on empires and how nations can continue to better themselves is very important, and we should continue to do it today.